obviously, since we're talking about residential schools in Sugarcane, I wanted to talk about the church and Christianity. So in your film Sugarcane, you show the inner conflict of an elder, I won't give it away, who appears to have love and loyalty for the church, but at the same time grapples with this reality of the abuse he and his family members suffered at the hands of the priests at St. Joseph's Residential School. And when he tells a high-ranking clergyman from the church that ran St. Joseph's about this generational abuse, the clergyman says, and I quote, after the 80s, the church accepted more psychology and began to understand people with mental illness need to be removed from ministry. And it wasn't right. It's a terrible, tragic 100 years. Now, I wanted to put this clergyman's comments in the context of the Christian ideology underlying and justifying the colonization of North America by quoting from the First Charter of Virginia, issued by King James the First of England in 1606. So in this charter, the king commended a small group of European Christian corporate shareholders for wishing to propagate Christian religion to people living in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God, and to bring the infidels and savages living in those parts to human civility. Therefore, King James granted these men license to all the lands, woods, rivers, mines, minerals, waters, other things, and commodities. And this was back in 1606. So several hundreds of years before many of the incidents in St. Joseph's take place. So, contrary to what the high-ranking clergyman in Sugarcane said, the violence perpetrated on Native children was not a result of the mental illness of a few errant clergymen in Canadian residential schools, but of a centuries-old Christian ideology of superiority that considered First Peoples to be infidels and savages. My question to you both is, as you lived among the First Nations people on the Sugarcane Reserve, were you able to understand how those who follow Christianity now are able to reconcile their faith with this racist, colonialist ideology underlying it and the violence perpetrated on them by the religion's teachers and priests?
Yeah, I'll just start with a brief historical note, which I think is that what's interesting to me about so many of these sort of, especially the once you get later into like the later 1800s, the ability of the colonizer to actually act out those sorts of ideas became real. But actually, for the vast majority of colonial history up until that point, um, you know, it was more likely that Native people would, have to be taken care of or supporting the colonizers who ended up, living on those lands. And there are many instances of us like helping out the explorer, get from point A to point B so that they didn't die, or assimilating for example, the first colony in Virginia, the Roanoke colony, formerly, famously is the lost colony because it went missing. Well, what happened to it? I mean, like the consensus is pretty clearly that they assimilated into the indigenous society. So the church could say whatever it wanted to say, and I'm sure they believed what they said, but like the reality on the ground was that at Jamestown they resorted to cannibalism, and I don't believe that there were any cannibals within their vicinity. Um, that aside, I think that we're deeply spiritual people, as many people are, and that because of this history. Uh, Many of our people have become authentically Catholic. We were colonized, we are colonized, and Catholicism has become part of our tradition. There are hymns in Sukkot Machchin. I know how to sing many of them. And despite the fact that I'm not Catholic, like I go to Christmas Mass with my Kia, who's in the film, my grandmother, because that is something that means a lot to her, and because it's a place of community gathering, and um, that's part of who we are and what we do. I mean, there are are almost no Shuswap funerals that you could go to where there is not some form of Catholic or Christian presence. And while I wish obviously the history was different, the history is what it is. And the reality is that people survived, the abuses perpetrated by the Catholic Church and members of its clergy, in many instances praying to God in the way that they were taught at the schools with, a rosary in their hand. And as documentarians, it's not for us to necessarily pass. I mean, obviously, we can pass judgment on the history of that, but on the people for whom that is their truth, it's our responsibility to represent that faithfully.
Yeah, I think we were really drawn to Rick for this reason because he held this really complex duality. For those who haven't seen the film, Rick is a former chief who sits on the council. He's 77 years old when the film begins, and he is a practicing Catholic who was also not only faced abuse at the schools, but also carries a secret that I won't ruin, but has to do with his own Catholic faith, as well as his suffering at the hands of it, and for generations of his family. And I think we were drawn to that because he really represented a tension that a lot of the ways that a kid who would be totally isolated at one of these schools, not allowed to communicate with their peers in their language, being beaten, potentially being harmed sexually and physically, that they might seek refuge in the one kind, being portrayed to them, which would be Jesus. If that is, as if there is this kinder, more gentle person who probably looks more like a parent than any other figure in this institution, or a friend, then that's kind of all you've got. And when you're in a situation of deep trauma and isolation, there's that saying, there are no atheists in a foxhole. I think, in some ways that applies, in that you need something to hold on to. And so I think there's a dynamic with trauma as well, and what the kids suffered at the schools. And then I think there's also a generational piece of this. For Rick, for instance, a lot of his connection to the Catholic Church had to do with the fact that he was raised by his grandmother, who had become Catholic through the schools, but it had become so important to her that it was now important to him because she was the only kind figure in his life, and it mattered to her and her teachings. And so it became something that was passed down in the way that so many traditions are passed down in Indigenous communities. That also became a part of what was handed down. And when you are in a society that reveres elders, which many of us are not, but for those that are, you come to love and respect the traditions that they uphold and the things that they believe in. And so I think that was also a kind of big part of the equation. What I think is really interesting, of course, is when that starts to end and break. And I think in our generation, in Julian's generation, and even in his father's generation, it's a very different attitude, for the most part, towards the church. And I guess I wonder, I obviously haven't conducted any sort of academic studies or analysis on this, but if a particular amount of time and distance and processing and distance from the trauma to over generations allows the younger generations to separate themselves from the colonial harm and the whatever traditions were imposed by it, and to reject them. So that has been, observationally, was really interesting to see through the church. And like Julian said, it was so important to us that we portrayed the truth, and the truth is complicated.
I just would add one thing to what Emmy said, just because it's been itching the back of my brain for a minute. I think that everything that Em said is exactly spot on. The one thing that I would add is that they're within the sort of Catholic and colonial way of thinking about spirituality. Um, it had to be one or the other, which I think is a very, it had to be either you're a Catholic or you're a heathen. And I think that in not just the context of the sugarcane community and the surrounding Secwepemc people, but many other indigenous contexts, I think that there was a much more pluralistic conception of cosmology and spirituality that allowed Catholicism and Jesus and God to fit in within a broader array of customs and beliefs and understandings about the world and how it came to be and how it worked. That Catholicism was often, or Christianity more broadly, was able to be slotted into. That did not see things in such, absolute, it had to be this or that kind of terms. And just as another complete aside, there are some actually very funny, in my opinion, funny oral histories wherein that were like collected in the late 1800s, early 1900s from my people and our neighbors, wherein they like fit Jesus into the cosmology of the interior Salish peoples, but they're kind of like there was this figure Coyote who made the world, and then this guy Jesus came and told us about how to be like good people, but he didn't really get rid of all the monsters that were troubling us, and he didn't make all the things that Coyote did that feed us. So we're really grateful for Jesus, but but ultimately, like he didn't actually do as much, which I think is kind of hilarious, and is ultimately maybe how I feel about all of it too.
I think that's a great point, Julian. And I think part of what lends resilience to ancient peoples and ancient communities is the plurality with which they understand the world and live their lives. And then they can just simply absorb new teachings, whether they're imposed on them or not. And I think that's part of what resilience is based on.